today it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jessica Hellmann. I'm really pleased to have her here. We've had some great conversations so far. Jessica did her bachelor's in ecology at the University of Michigan, back when it was a school of natural resources, whereas now it's a school of
environment and sustainability,
reflecting a change that's happening in a lot of academia. She did her PhD at Stanford in biological sciences, did postdoctoral work there as well in their international security program, as well as at the University of British Columbia at the Center for Biological Diversity. She also did their Aldo Leopold program on environmental leadership, which has infected her with a sense of public service and public duty. Her academic career as a professorship started at Notre Dame in her biological sciences department, where she also created the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, which is still a resource. I've used it myself for looking at countries, a way to put numbers and assessing how vulnerable are they to climate change and how prepared are they for the coming climate change. She was instrumental in their environmental change initiative, as well as starting up a sustainability minor at the University at Notre Dame. More recently, she moved to the University of Minnesota, a slightly larger institution, where her academic home is the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. But her main duties are the director of their Institute on the Environment, which has a variety of missions, including integrating across all departments interdisciplinary, across all campus of the huge University of Minnesota system, with the mission of fostering interdisciplinary scholarly work and a mission of public service to the state, and is it fair to say globally? So it's a large mission, a tremendous mission statement. Today she's going to talk with us about climate adaptation for biodiversity and for us as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Hellmann.
Test this out. That sounds good. Can you all hear me? Good. Thank you, Peter, so much. It has been really fun today. I'm going to be here tomorrow. It's such a spectacular campus. I had the privilege of coming on a nice warm day. I assume it's always like this, not too warm. For a Minnesotan, it's wonderful to leave Minneapolis at this time of year and come a little bit further south. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to interact with you all. So I want to talk about this idea of adapting to climate change. And I'm going to give you a talk that's actually a combination of a talk that I would give to a public audience. So we're going to talk about why you should care about this issue, why it's important. And I'm not going to stay in my disciplinary space. I'm not going to just be an ecologist when we talk about this idea. But I'm also going to show you I'm going to give you a little bit of biology as well in this presentation. I'm going to show you some recent results. And I hope what my end goal is that you will see how science and lots of non-scientific issues having to do with us as a civilization, our responsibility to other people and to our planet, how these ideas come together around climate change and climate change adaptation. So if you came just for a biology seminar, you're going to hear some other stuff too, including talking about people. Okay, so we have to start with a bit of a dose of realism. I hope you've heard that the climate is changing, and it's actually changing a lot, and it's changing quickly. Not that long ago, we talked about when climate change happens. Now we talk about climate change is happening. So adapting to climate change is not something for 30 years from now or 50 years from now. It's for today and the next decade and the decades thereafter. So here's an example. There's lots of evidence that CO2 and other greenhouse gases are already changing our planet. This is the 2017 monsoon in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. This monsoon was intensified by warmer surface waters. So the monsoon is a regular meteorological phenomena made worse by climate change, by warmer seas. This was killed thousands of people, displaced thousands more. Closer to home, we had last summer a huge heat wave. There were places in California that the temperature exceeded 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, it's not out of the ordinary to have hot days, but hotter and more frequent is the new norm thanks to climate change. And that broke some of the records for the hottest temperatures ever recorded in parts of California. So we are going to decide, however, exactly how much of this climate change we're going to allow by how much greenhouse gases we decide to release. And as a consequence of how much climate change are we going to allow, we spend a lot of time talking about how to address emissions of greenhouse gases. But what I want to tell you in my presentation today, that stopping climate change, which is incredibly important, and I'll say more about, but it really is only half of the story. The other half of the story is an aspect of climate change that you're not hearing that much about, or you're likely not hearing about it as much as you should. And this other side is going to keep us busy for decades, figuring out how to do it, and then putting that into action. And what is that other side of climate change? The side that I would argue you're not hearing as much as you should is adaptation. So stopping greenhouse gases, stopping climate change, we call mitigation. Living with climate change is something we call adaptation. It's about surviving. It's about finding ways, even where it's possible, to thrive in the face of climate change. And even if we hit the brakes on greenhouse gas emissions right now, we will have to adapt to a changing climate, to the new climate we've created. I'd like to talk about this with an analogy to medicine. So imagine you were to wake up tomorrow and 100% of the world's population was affected by some sort of serious chronic disease. We would have awareness campaigns, we'd have benefit concerts. This is something we'd invest in research to find a cure. We'd find ways of making everyday life more manageable and ways of actually living with that chronic disease. And that is how we can think of, and I think we should think of, adaptation. It is living our best with a chronic disease. But the problem is we essentially have no or very few treatments for this climate disease, at least not yet, and we have billions, literally billions of people who will suffer from this chronic disease. And I think that gap, the gap between the need to address this challenge and the lack of good management solutions before us is worth a whole lot of attention and a lot of benefit concerts. So if we're going to treat the symptoms, so this is about treating the symptoms of this chronic disease, what adaptation is about. First, we have to understand what we are up against. So I want to spend a little time telling you essentially how bad could this climate change disease get. If we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases right now, we would have a world that is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was, on average, before the start of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, we already have had about 2 degrees of warming, especially during winter, and that has done things like cause these heat waves and these storms that I showed at the beginning. In fact, cold states like my state of Minnesota have actually warmed more than other parts of the United States. There was a really interesting New York Times article about this the other day that said part of the continental US that has warmed the most is this band between Montana and Michigan, especially in the winter time. It has warmed more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit just since in my lifetime. And so this disease, that's the amount we've seen so far, but this disease called climate change could get a lot worse. This is what we call a business as usual projection of what the future might hold. So if we do not address the greenhouse gas emissions that we have today, and we do not curtail them in the future, or aggressively curtail them, this is the world that we could have by the end of this century. So this is a world that's about 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it should be, and that amount of warming happens within 100 years. And if you look at certain places, especially over land, there's more warming over land than over the oceans, and more warming toward the poles than the equator. So places like where I come from in Minnesota are actually warming more than the average. Those temperatures could increase, like where this arrow points, 9 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And of course, this is just a snapshot on time. This is 2 decades in a moment in time, and warming actually continues on after the end of this century. So if you take Minnesota, for example, that world that I just showed you, by the end of the century, would have, in my home state, more than 30 days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now we have about 10. So that would be like the entire month of August has our very hottest days every day in August. Today we have about 10. In Virginia, that would be about 60 days over 95 degrees. 2 months out of the summer would have a temperature that is upwards of what we now consider some of our hottest days. Now, these hot days are definitely unpleasant for people, but this amount of warming would eliminate the habitat of some plants and animals. And that is why the polar bear is the climate change poster child. It's very cute. That's another reason why it's a poster child for climate change. But oftentimes we show and talk about the polar bear because there is this future that I described. In this future I described, there's nowhere for the polar bear to go. Because in a 6.5 degree world, it doesn't have polar ice. Therefore, it doesn't have habitats for polar bears as we have known them. So it's not just unpleasant summers, it's the conditions that certain species need could be eliminated from Earth. Biologists think that up to 900,000 species could face extinction due to climate change within this century. Like the polar bear, within 100 years in that 6.5 degree world. 900,000 species. And that doesn't count species that would decline without going extinct or stress to habitats or ecosystems or changes in ecosystem health. Now, we can also put this amount of change, the change that we're fearful about biodiversity, in historic perspective. The last time that the climate was this much cooler, so the last time the climate was as different as I just showed in these previous slides, was during the last ice age. And you can take a place on Earth and you can imagine how different the climate was. So this is a picture on the left of Death Valley in California. Maybe you've visited it. Even if you haven't visited it, you've probably heard about it. It's a desert. It's hot and very dry. What are the kinds of creatures that live there? The kinds of organisms that are adapted to those conditions. But during the peak of the last ice age, this ecosystem or this location on Earth was a mesic evergreen forest, like the picture on the right. So when we imagine the amount of climate change that we could have within the next 100 years, from the point of view of biology, it could be as different as a forest and a desert. And the species that lived in Death Valley moved out and were entirely replaced by a different set of taxa. The last time CO2 concentration was comparable to this scenario I just showed, there were relatives, this is tens of millions of years ago, there were relatives of alligators living at the poles. So what idea we have in our mind about what lives where under normal climate is profoundly different under the amount of climate change that may very well happen within 100 years. Definitely a different normal, big changes. So this sort of ice age warming, like I described in Death Valley, took thousands of years to take place. Human-caused modern climate change will take hundreds. This time we caused the climate change, and that's important. It has certain ethical and other implications for stewardship. But the bigger aspect of that is we are here to live with the consequences of that climate change. We are both the cause, but we are the people who will suffer the consequences. So this causes a lot of biologists and people who focus on mitigation to say that 6.5 degree world is something we need to stay away from. It is important to get greenhouse gas emissions under control because that amount of change is a large amount of change. But despite all the debating about climate change, we do know exactly where and how and when how to stop it. In fact, stopping climate change is actually pretty easy. I'll claim it's even simple. And how do you stop climate change? Well, it's easy because all you need is an economic revolution. We need clean energy, and we need clean transportation, and we need sustainable agriculture. And it is absolutely the case that we have serious difficulties with cost, with financing, and even with political will to cause this economic revolution to take place. But we do have the knowledge and the technology needed to do it. And we also know the scale of the problem. We know that we have already used up 3/4 of the 3,700 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we can ever emit to the atmosphere if we want to avoid catastrophic warming. So this is a kind of mitigation math, if you will. We can calculate how much of our budget is used up and how much space we have left in our budget. But when we talk about adaptation, we don't have math like this. We don't have technologies like wind power and solar and electric vehicles that are ready to deploy. We don't have this clarity. We don't have a toolbox of adaptation technologies, and we don't even know how much adaptation we actually need or where it is the highest priority to deploy it. And essentially, I think that's why each day when we're here at the university, in all kinds of classes and all kinds of disciplines, we should talk about this future we're confronting and what we are going to do to survive and thrive in it. We need to come up with that math. We need to come up with the technologies and the design plans and the strategies and the business models that are going to allow adaptation to come to life around the world. So, I'm an ecologist. Peter said that my home department is ecology and evolution and behavior. How is it that I now talk about electric cars and the mathematics of adaptation and the climate change debate that you should be thinking more about? I got there through butterflies. I still get there many days by thinking about butterflies. So I want to tell you a little story about a couple stories about butterflies. And butterflies have been my window into thinking about what it means to adapt to climate change. And in fact, I first started working with this specific butterfly. This is the Bay checker spot butterfly. It's an federally listed endangered species. It lives in the Bay Area. At one time, one of the healthiest populations of the Bay checker spot butterfly lived at a place called Jasper Ridge, the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. But the number of butterflies at Jasper Ridge steadily declined over time, from thousands of individuals to 0. And it was a series of hot and dry years, a bad year followed by a bad year, followed by a bad year, that were the final nail in the checker spot coffin and caused that population of that endangered species to go extinct. And what is interesting about this butterfly is that it eats plants that dry up each summer. So again, if you visited California, you'll know that late in the summer it gets kind of the golden hills of California. You get this dried out end of the growing season situation. And so this butterfly is eating as fast as it can and as much as it can before that summer drought comes on. And when the drought comes on, it needs to enter something we call diapause, and then it essentially goes to sleep until the next growing season starts. The trick is, if it runs out of food, if that summer drought comes too soon, it can't reach diapause, and you have massive mortality, and that's what causes those population declines and the nails in the coffin. So what I was studying at the time was looking at how these butterfly caterpillars are using different host plants. And though the grassland is senescing in the summertime, it doesn't senesce evenly across these different species of plant. There was one plant that is the most common food plant for this caterpillar. It is actually the first to senesce. But there's another plant that's less commonly used, but it lasts a little bit longer. And we were able to show that if a caterpillar can switch on to that other host plant, it extends the growing season and it increases the number of caterpillars that make it through, and essentially adds to the resiliency of this endangered population. And that was the very first time I thought, there's something that could potentially be done to help this creature. We don't have to just stand by and say, climate change is causing summer to come early, and that is causing the butterfly to go extinct. There are meaningful differences in the ecosystem that provide management and adaptation strategies for us. Essentially, what we could do is we could encourage that second host plant. We could manage for that second host plant in the butterfly's habitat to help it when it's hot. And that was the first time I was ever exposed to the idea that you could manipulate and through management reduce the exposure of individuals to climate change. And that is essentially a form of adapting to climate. And that was just one small example. That's just of what it means to adapt to climate change. That was an example of habitat management. There are other ways that you might do biodiversity adaptation. In fact, habitat management might not be sufficient. If the climate changes too much or too fast, we might need other things, which allows me to introduce you to another butterfly. This is also a federally listed endangered species. This is the Karner blue butterfly. And I'll show you a map of where it lives. Historically, it lived at these black dots. Many of these black dots are no longer occupied. Like, for example, there are no populations in Minnesota anymore, no populations in Ontario. But for the most part, it was a Great Lakes states and New England distributed species. But we wanted the climate that is characterized by these black dots is moving. Let me show you that. The conditions at the black dots are actually headed north. In the coming decades, the climate that is suitable for the Karner is going to occur in these green blobs. So in 2030, 2050, and 2080. By 2080, the distance between those black dots and those little green blobs is about 300 to 400 miles. And that is a very, very long way for a little butterfly to fly. And if we don't help the Karner keep up with that changing climate, if we don't help it move hundreds of miles, we might lose it entirely. So that leads us to another possible adaptation strategy: helping things move. How do we help things move? We may need to build pathways and corridors that make the landscape more permeable to species' natural migration. Here's another thing we could do. We could pick them up and carry them where they need to go. something we've called assisted migration, or our preferred term is managed relocation. That's the idea depicted in this Boston Globe cartoon. And that is because a human could carry a little butterfly a lot farther and a lot faster than it could ever move on its own, especially if its climate is moving further and faster than it can. So we could help things through managed relocation. We might help things to get over a barrier, like this is the San Francisco Bay that's being depicted for this endangered rodent in this cartoon. But we could move it simply for the pace of keeping up with that changing climate. And I want to unpack this idea of moving species on purpose. So this is an intervention, a relocation of an organism, because you see, in order to combat the effects the effect of climate change on it. So let's look a little bit more. This idea of managed relocation has actually gotten quite a lot of media attention. This is a bit of an old article, but this was in the New York Times in 2009. This was about collecting seeds so that later, potentially, those seeds could be used to relocate native plant species further to the north. I love this article, though, and I love showing this to students because this little question they ask in the article has such an obvious answer. It's any great science question, it's like, you don't even need to do this study. You know the answer. Is it wise or foolish to assist with the migration of plants? The answer to that is yes. Yes, it is wise, and it may also be foolish. That's not an interesting question. The interesting question is, what is the balance of the good reasons and the risks? So in the case of moving species on purpose because of climate change, you would do it because of a conservation concern or the desire to enhance some sort of ecosystem good or ecosystem service. And the potential unintended consequences could be creating new pests, endangering source populations, or my personal favorite, wasting your time and money. So here's an adaptation strategy. We could move things. I showed you a creature that might even need to be moved. But to evaluate the necessity of that movement is ultimately about balancing the pros and the cons. We asked experts not too long ago, some colleagues and I, we wanted to know what did people who think about these issues a lot, what are their concerns about managed relocation? So in a survey of experts, these are published scientists, we asked them a whole bunch of questions, but one of them we said, what do you think overall of this idea of managed relocation? And it had been a controversial topic in the literature, and I had definitely contributed to some of that controversy. So we thought, oh, this is going to be controversial. People are going to love this idea or they're going to hate it. And they didn't. The vast majority of our respondents weren't sure. Very few people strongly supported the idea of managed relocation or completely rejected it. To me, this says there's scientists with an open mind that says we need to do research to figure out the appropriateness and the utility of this adaptation strategy. We don't know yet. To try to tease out if they could differentiate between different circumstances, we gave them some examples, some three sort of case studies. And so we asked them, what do you think of managed relocation in this case? And what I want to show you here is that in each of these three cases, we got a different answer. So we asked people if they thought moving species around was justified, if it would work, and if they would support it overall, which is presumably they would support it if it was effective and justifiable. We asked them about an endangered species. It wasn't the Carner blue, but for our purposes, you could think about it, we asked them about an endangered butterfly, not the Carner blue, but it's a useful analogy. We asked them, so this is a species, if you don't move it, it's going to go extinct. We said, what about your moving things, not because of conservation reasons, it's not a species that's going to go extinct, but because you could grow a valuable ecosystem good, in this case, timber production, in new areas. And then we asked them this sort of ecologically complicated question. We said, what if, and there's evidence to suggest that corals part of the problem that some coral populations are having in their sensitivity to warmer temperatures, there's variation geographically in the symbionts that are part of corals, that you could relocate these things called zooxanthellae from other locations and inoculate the coral and help protect it from warmer temperatures. So that's moving one species to help another species in an interaction between two species. So for butterflies, is it justifiable? Most people said yes. Would it work? Yes. Would they support it? Yes. How about for timber species? Less justifiable. Would it work? Sure. You could plant trees in new places. They probably grow. Would they support it? Not so much. And the opposite for the corals. Do they think that moving this symbiont of corals could be justified? Do they think it would work? I don't know. Now it's a little bit more ecologically complex. And would they support it a little more so? So in here we see a lot of context dependence. Why do I raise this? Because I told you adaptation deserves more of your attention. This ecological context, it's not whether managed relocation is appropriate or not appropriate. It's where and when and for who and for what reasons and how do you do it that matters. We got to figure that out. I want to share with you another butterfly example. Because is there evidence that species are moving on their own as the climate changes? The answer to that is absolutely yes. There are now a variety of documented cases of species changing their geography as the climate has changed. I want to show you an interesting case that's a little bit different. This is a paper that we just published recently. In this particular case of species moving, we wanted to look at species that hybridize, so they interbreed. So this is a species of swallowtail butterfly, which if you study butterflies, it's always good to study swallowtails because they are like a real respectable butterfly. Like they look like a butterfly. Sometimes if you say, I used to sometimes have studied this species called a dusky wing. It's this puny little brown thing. I've had people say, that's not a butterfly. But when you study a swallowtail, it's legit. It's pretty. So there's a species called the Canadian tiger swallowtail, and then another species in this blue, that's its range. In black, there's this thing called the eastern tiger swallowtail. And then they hybridize where they're along the Appalachian Mountains and across the Midwest, where they come into contact with one another. And what we wanted to know is, how have these species been responding to warming? And so we had an opportunity to study where they interact with one another. Because there are several interesting possibilities. First of all, maybe they're not maybe they're not moving. Nothing in this zone is moving as the climate changes. Maybe they're just declining as the climate changes. Or maybe the hybrid zone itself is moving. Both species together are moving to the north. Or maybe there are some parts of the species that are moving. This is what we were initially super interested in, this idea that maybe genes are moving in response to climate change through this hybridization, and the species are introgressing in a different way. So here's what we found. Well, I should say, what we had, wrong way. What we had was the ability to sample across this hybrid zone. So we had a bunch of samples that were collected by a colleague of ours in the 80s, from down in Illinois through Wisconsin and up into Canada, essentially across the Wisconsin hybrid zone, which if you know much about this region and you wonder, where is that exactly? The answer is I-94. They hybridize at I-94. So we had historic samples. Then we went back and got thousands of individuals sampled in a modern sampling across that hybrid zone. And that's what I show in this picture. Without giving you a bunch of details about how to do genomics, just know people can do genomics these days. I want you to first look at the blue lines. Each of these blue lines represents essentially a gene or a piece of the genome that is in individuals that were sampled across that hybrid zone. So as you go from south to north, each of these genes transitions from the northern or the southerly form into the more northerly form as you go further to the north. And the blue lines are each of those sequences, thousands of them we can measure using genomic techniques, from those samples in the 80s. And you can see that they mostly tend to transition from the southern to the northern species at kind of the same spot. That's the hybrid zone. And this dashed line marks the middle of those. Then you go back with your samples that you collected 30 years later. Those are the red lines. So again, each one of these red lines is a separate piece of genetic material. So think of it like a gene. And it transitions from the southern form to the northern form. What I want you to see is that for the most part, there is a little bit of sort of broadening and changes of the slope between the blue lines and the red lines. But mostly there has been a shift between the center of the blue, which is the dashed line, to the center of the red, which is the solid line, about 38 kilometers. So over the last 30 years, the hybrid zone, with relatively little evidence for change in actually intermixing, the hybrid zone in both of these species has moved north about 40 kilometers. And I'm not going to show you the data for this or the evidence for this, but the reasoning is that the southern species is able to pull off 2 generations per year, something we call bivoltine, and the northern species can only pull off 1. And as the climate has warmed, it has enabled that 2 generation to move further to the north. And that 40 kilometers corresponds to about a 60 kilometer. So if you look at the climate would tell you that the climate has shifted about 60 kilometers, and the butterflies have shifted about 40 kilometers. And I raise this because we're talking about science, and this is a science figure, and it has a bunch of genetics in there, and I just published it, and I like it. But I also raise it because I said we need to think about what it means to help ecosystems adapt. So we need to do this kind of work that allows us to detect, are species moving? At what rate are they moving? Also, here we're looking at actual genes that are involved in climatic tolerance. So when we think about how we're going to manage species in the future, we're going to need to know what are the traits and the genes that we're looking for. So we actually need to know a lot about the biology of the organisms we're seeking to modify. But I said this is going to be about biodiversity and people too. Butterflies, polar bears, pick your favorite plant and animal. They are going to respond to climate change, and as stewards of the earth and of biodiversity for all the reasons it benefits us, we're going to need to help manage those systems better to help them survive and thrive under climate change. But people are going to need to adapt to climate too. And just like the Karner blue butterfly, people could be stranded by climate change. And we already see people moving from places affected by climate stress. In 2015, for example, more than 500,000 people crossed the Mediterranean to southern Europe, and thousands of people died along the way. This is a flow of refugees from Africa and the Middle East to Europe, and that flow could grow to tens of millions of people within the coming days because of things like crop failure, water shortage caused by climate change. So this is 500,000 people. Within a couple of decades, we could have tens of millions of people. And that is a very scary number, but I want to claim that international migration can reduce the vulnerability of people to climate change. It is an adaptation strategy. In fact, if you compare recent international migration that happened in the last 5 years to a measure of vulnerability by country that Peter referenced earlier, something we call the Global Adaptation Index, you can actually calculate how much migration is changing global human exposure to climate change. And in the last 5 years, by moving around, the, on average, we have reduced the exposure of people to climate change by 15%. I'm not suggesting that migration is always easy or good or desirable, but I am suggesting that migration for people is one adaptation strategy. So how did this happen, this 15% value? How do we measure that? Let me show you a little bit more about it. So what we compared migrating people who are going from one location to another location over a 5-year period. And if we know the vulnerability of the country they started from and the country they ended in, we can calculate the degree to which that vulnerability changed due to that migration or associated with that migration. And we use that, the vulnerability component comes from an index that we can look at vulnerability in 6 key socioeconomic sectors: food, water, ecosystem services, human habitats, infrastructure, and health. And this is what the data look like. In general, that 15% happens because the bulk of migration takes from relatively lower income and higher vulnerability countries toward higher income and lower vulnerability countries. And this picture shows that. So if you take all the countries of the world and you divide them into 4 groups, low, medium, medium, high, and high vulnerability category. So 4 bins. What is your level of vulnerability? These arrows show you the flow of people into and out of these 4 categories. So the lowest vulnerability categories are these blue guys, countries. These are all the lowest vulnerability countries. And what you can see here is a lot of migration happens within countries in that low vulnerability category. That's the blue moving to the blue, this big blue arrow. The next vulnerable group are the green countries. And most of the migrants from green go to blue. Those are people reducing their vulnerability through migration. And some of the migrants from green go to other greens. That's this little green right here. And some flow to yellow. Let's see if I have a picture there. Yeah. Some flow also to yellow and to red. So they're going to places of higher vulnerability. The next group, yellow. Yellow is flowing to green, which is one step less vulnerable, and also flowing a lot to blue. Again, reducing vulnerability through migration. And then where is red flowing? Some of red is flowing to yellow, to green, and to blue. However, there are examples of people moving from lower vulnerability to higher vulnerability. And you also see, like, for example, this red arrow of people who are trapped, who are migrating within high vulnerability countries, and they're not reducing their vulnerability through migration. This needs to be, we argued, a focus of adaptation, attention, and efforts. So there's a lot more we could say about these pictures, and you can look at different arrows and talk about what's happening behind them. But I just mean to show that, at least with respect to climate change, movement can help people in terms, just like perhaps it could help the Karner blue, and that migration can be an adaptation strategy. And if we were to think of migration as being beneficial under climate change, how we would manage and strategize and enable and promote that migration is an enormous question, deserving, again, a lot of our attention. Okay. Now, if we want to we can think about adaptation. It's not so simple, as I suggested with managed relocation. It's not so simple as to say, oh, here's an adaptation strategy, let's do it. There are always going to be pros and cons. In evaluating adaptation options, we essentially need to be in the business of diagnosing the benefits and the risks. There are some adaptation strategies where those negative consequences outweigh the positive ones. There's some pretty easy ways to imagine that. So for example, there are some adaptation strategies we will know will have big negative side effects. Here's one. If you use air conditioning powered by fossil fuels to fight against heat waves, the side effect will be more climate change. And that is the definition of a bad strategy. But there can be win-win adaptation strategies. We need to identify those. Here's one with fewer side effects or even positive side effects. If instead of using air conditioners, we used green roofs and green space, those green roofs and green space can take the edge off of hot days, which save lives and reduce things like building demand. That is a better adaptation strategy because it can even have positive side effects. We actually did a study not too long ago looking at green roofs in Chicago, and we showed that during the hottest days, if you were to cover 25% of Chicago's roofs with green roofs, you could reduce the hottest temperature of that day by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. If you covered the entire city, you could reduce it by 5. That doesn't exactly make it pleasant, but it definitely has an influence on survivorship and again on energy building demand. So that is an adaptation strategy for reducing heat that can have, that is a good energy or adaptation strategy, a smarter strategy. So we're just beginning to figure out how much, just scratching the surface of adaptation. What could we do? How would we do it? How do we evaluate the pros and the cons? Here's a provocative idea. How much might it cost? There was a recent UN estimate suggested that adaptation could cost $500 billion every year by 2050. Billion with a B. $500 billion per year. That's a lot of money, a lot of economic impact, and thus demanding a lot of our attention. Now, adaptation is not going to solve all of our problems. I want to remind us that by telling us the polar bear. There is no adaptation strategy that could preserve polar ice in the face of catastrophic climate change. So there may be some species, some ecosystems, some economies for which adaptation cannot solve our problems. But there are many occasions where adaptation can have positive effects. And we are going to need to put those interventions in place everywhere around the world. We need to, for example, design and build mangroves that protect coastal shorelines. And I think about this all the time. I've told several of you, I have an 11-year-old daughter. And when I see a picture like this, I think about her in these coming decades being one of those actors and those agents that will be responsible for implementing adaptation solutions. Literally one of these people potentially planting mangroves to protect shorelines in the coming years. Now, I want to say one more thing before I end, and because I want to make something abundantly clear. I've talked about climate change is a big deal. I gave some scary numbers that says if we don't watch out, we could have no polar ice or no polar bears. 900,000 species go extinct. In our discipline, in environmental science, we spend a lot of time talking about these negative consequences. We talk about impacts. We talk about vulnerability of people. And we even talk about things as if they are hard and fast facts. And it is absolutely true that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. That is a fact. But a lot of what we need from science and from scientists going forward and in this adaptation space is not going to be straightforward facts. It's going to be helping to evaluate these pros and cons, and it's going to be about enabling good decision making. I put conservation up here too because I think we need to start thinking about what it means to do conservation differently. Not just saving things the way they used to be, but imagining how they might be different in the future. So I think we need to be moving away from some of this language. Here's some language that I think scientists can contribute to. And if we want to bring the public along with us in this tackling climate change adaptation, we need to use these words more. You don't see these words in the scientific literature nearly as much. Words like freedom, prosperity, what it means to be good stewards of the earth, and how we're going to go about doing this adaptation in a way that is equitable. I think these are inspiring words. I think these are words that cause us to want to engage society, including in some of the values that come up in the scientific work that we do. And these are words that I'm excited about. So lest you think that I presented a lot of scary things about climate change, I want you to realize that tackling climate change provides a lot of the future of where society and humanity is going, and will ultimately dictate whether that is a positive future or a scary future, or to the degree to which it can be positive. Our future can include things like restored mangroves to protect coastal ecosystems and green urban areas because they're beneficial under a warmer environment. So I want us to keep talking about how to stop climate change. We must do that. But I wanted to show you that the technology, the mathematics, the timing of what is necessary to do that is well understood. And we have to get that done, and we need to do that now. But I want you to walk away from my presentation today thinking about this other side of climate change, the adaptation side, and that it needs more of our attention. And that essentially we need a whole generation of practitioners, people who are able to study and evaluate and help make decisions around adaptation to treat that climate change disease. And that won't just be about butterflies or polar bears. It will be about people too. So thank you for your time and attention. I think I have, here's my, see the positive future. Yeah.
I found a lot of your data visualizations really compelling.
Okay.
And I was wondering about, I imagine that's really...
Use my blue lines and my red lines?
Oh,
No.
yes. Well, I didn't understand everything yet.
Yes.
But I was trying. But there's a lot of artistry behind them, and I imagine a lot of intentionality. And can you talk about sort of the communication behind presenting scientific data?
I could talk about that for a long time. It would be a fun conversation, a cup of coffee or something like that. But here's one thought that was told to me a long time ago that I try to remember. Well, two interrelated thoughts. One is sometimes we teach scientists, including students, that you will impress people with your smarts if you put like everything that you know onto your slide. And you're like, look at all this data I have, and that might feel impressive, but rarely does it accomplish the effect that it wants. That's one thought. The other thought is we tend to take a lot of, when we publish work, for example, we take the published version of a figure and we put it in our PowerPoint presentation. But that published version was intended for a reader, with a nice legend and all this stuff. When you're giving a presentation, you actually have a point. And so you need to redraw your figure to make the point that you're trying to make. So in that picture that has the red and the blue, in the printed version, there's not a big 38 kilometers there. It says that in fine print, but I want to show the gap. So I redrew the picture in a way that I could illustrate the gap. That's one idea. Think about what you want to say and then be willing to actually redraw your images instead of just copying and pasting them up there.
I have a question for you about humans and the effect. So we've mostly been talking about the negative effects of climate change on humans. Is it possible that there are components of the human populations, I'm thinking particularly of Russia, that may look at climate change as, yeah, that sounds pretty good to us?
Yes and no. So the most important thing about climate change, because you could say the same thing about biodiversity, right? That there will be some species who will undoubtedly take advantage of these changing conditions. We think about this frequently, like maybe invasive species or pest species or species that have really rapid dispersal capabilities or super heat tolerant. They'll say, these are the conditions I've been waiting for, and I'm going to get a leg up on all those taxa that can't respond favorably. And that is true, but I think the main thing to remember about climate change, including from a human system perspective, is that it is a perturbation. So it's not so much bad or good, it's more different. So it might be that agriculture is possible, for example, in parts of Siberia where it wasn't possible before. But that still is going to necessitate the transition to take advantage of that. So that comes at an economic cost. That is what it is. But there's infrastructure that would need to be put in place and people who will, that there's a transition associated with that. So it's not value neutral, but I guess I'm suggesting in some cases it could be managed. It doesn't do us good to say it's all bad, but I think to pretend that it's like, we'll just grow corn in new places, that is a significant social implementation associated with doing that. Similarly, this is true for any adaptation. We think, we'll just save the Karner blue by moving it to new locations. Well, it's not going to be easy. It's not just like, that sounds like a piece of cake. Even if it's feasible, it's not going to be completely straightforward. Jen.
So going back to a little bit what we discussed in my class and then feeding off of some of these other comments. Generalists and specialists.
Yes.
Leave out the people.
Okay.
I mean the animals. Other organisms. We'll talk about
Okay.
those people, animals.
Vertebrates. Yes.
In terms of learning in academia,
Us.
are we doing a benefit to have degrees for students specialize in a particular field? Or is it more beneficial to have degrees where there is that interdisciplinary nature and we produce students who are generalists but not experts in any one field?
Either answer I give, I'm going to get in trouble with somebody, right?
I guess, let me, while you're thinking about that, so we're trying to produce students who are able to tackle the current challenges of society. And there have been different schools of thought on how to address that. And there doesn't seem to be one great answer for another, and I didn't know if you had
I do
an opinion
think,
on it.
yeah. I do have an opinion on it. I do think that we must produce students who are broadly capable of crossing over disciplines. It's beneficial, or it's a good thing that increasingly that's what employers actually say they want. And there was a period in time where that wasn't the case. Give me a computer scientist, I don't care what else they can do. Give me a chemical engineer, I'm just going to put them in the lab. But I think more and more, and sustainability being one example, I need somebody who I can put in the lab, but is also broadly competent to understand, like our brand strategy or our sustainability protocols. So I think we are doing right by making sure that students are not narrowly defined. So they must have some component of them that's interdisciplinary. My personal view on that is to have your cake and eat it too, that you're a chemist and a sustainability minor, or that we have ways for students to demonstrate their proficiency in a discipline, which often is just methodological, right? Like, how do you think like a biologist? How would you go figure out how to do some new biology technique? Because it's not like we're actually going to teach you everything that you're going to use the next 30 years. I always say, we taught Fortran, right? No one uses Fortran, but once you knew how to use Fortran, we could learn something else. And then here's the thing that might be a little bit more controversial. I furthermore think that especially in the sciences, as that people are going to need graduate degrees, increasingly so. And God help us, maybe the marketplace would really value those graduate degrees. I think if that's the case, that is the time for some disciplinary specialty. And that makes the undergraduate opportunity to be even more well-rounded and sort of a sampling and providing a broader context in which you're going to add a deep dive later. That's my opinion. So I often ask students when they say, how broad should I be? I say, are you going to go to grad school? And if they are, then I say, this is it. This is your chance to sample widely, be sure you're able to interact with your colleagues, that kind of stuff. But you probably have an opinion about that also. And also in my institute, we believe very strongly in co-curricular things. So have your degree in chemistry, even if it's not a certificate or a minor that you're doing, be cognizant of making sure that you're building broad experiences. So we do a lot of leadership training or putting you in internships, you know, that kind of way of making sure that you're broad. It doesn't just have to be reflected in what it says on your piece of paper.
Last question.
So I agree with Rob. It was a fantastic talk in terms of just the science communication and other things. I mean, this really compelling point about needing more knowledge about adaptation. Well, no, fine. Period. Full
Okay.
stop. So I was just curious if you had an estimate, right? So you talked about adaptation being context specific. You laid out some example strategies. Right?
Yeah.
So for species that are patchy, like the Carter blue,
Yeah.
or they only have small remaining, they're in serpentine areas, or they only have small remaining patches, you can assist them with migration.
Yeah.
For species where you have large swaths of habitat left, or they can move well, like a swallowtail, you can make corridors.
Yes.
Or something like that. And then for
Or
polar bears,
potentially even just facilitate the sort of intermixing that might take place, you know, a combination of those two. But yes.
and there's more strategies.
Yes, more,
And
yes.
But for polar bears,
There's no strategy.
So of the 900,000 species,
Yeah.
that are protected
How many of them
how
are
many-
polar bears?
how many-
Okay, so I'm going to change your question because actually it would make an incredibly awesome research question. The one you just said would too. What fraction of biodiversity could be, actually we're working on this a little bit, trying to figure this out. What fraction of that biodiversity could be saved through adaptation actions? I have no idea. I guess it would probably depend on how much we were going to spend or how much effort we were going to put into it. I don't know. And does a zoo count? If a zoo doesn't count or a seed bank, then
But not even spending, like, how much do we have the knowledge? Like, even if we weren't, you were making an argument that we don't even have the knowledge yet for adaptation stuff.
yeah, but we could gain the knowledge. Like if we sequence the human genome. I mean, we traveled to the moon. If we just decided that this was important, we could figure a lot of this stuff out. I mean, especially that sequencing stuff that I showed. 15 years ago, we wouldn't have that information. You know, we could gather a lot of information if it was a priority. I don't know. It depends. Is it a Monday or a Wednesday? Are you in a good mood or a not good mood? Part of me wants to say, I think that if we made it a priority, like there's no reason why the Carter blue butterfly would need to go extinct. But in the absence of pretty aggressive action and a lot of acceptance for those actions, it will go extinct. So some days I would say, let's say that 75% of those 900,000 species we could do something about. Other days I think like, oh my God, the Fish and Wildlife Service can't even get everybody together on a phone call to talk about the Carter blue. How would we ever? I'm not giving you a good answer, but I know it's a terrific question. So what we've been thinking about, and I know everyone wants to leave, I'm really enamored with, there was a paper a long time ago now written by Sokolow and Pakala at Princeton. And it was called, maybe many of you have taught it now, it was like the wedges paper, right? So they said, when I argued, we know the mathematics for mitigation, that's essentially what they said. We know how much CO2 we have to not emit. We have this suite of technologies, and we can just start slotting them in. We get this much nuclear and this much energy efficiency and this much ethanol and whatever, and we'll just add it all up and see how we do. I want us to do that for adaptation. I want to know, how big is the pie, and can I fill the pie with available strategies? So, for example, I really like to talk about managed relocation, but if I were hypothesizing about that pie, I think that actually managed relocation would be a tiny little slice. It's too hard, it would be expensive, we don't even know where some things live. So I think it's intriguing, but I think realistically not a big piece of the pie. So I'd love to know what the different pieces would be and the adequacy of those pieces, which is very closely related to what you're asking. And I don't even know how we figure that out, because we don't even know how big is the pie, right? They actually know what they're trying to achieve. All right, go on, Pete.
We're well past.
Yeah.